Hello, Dr. Griffin. Hope you're doing well. So I'm going to break this up into three parts. So first I'm going to talk about how an entire race will be demonized based on acts that a specific few people of color make, and how this is not the same case for whites. Second, I'm going to talk about cultural exceptionalism, and third, about the multiracial nation. So anti-immigrant sentiments and xenophobia existed prior to 9/11, and they were fueled by negative media portrayals and discriminatory laws and policies. For example, when we watched The American Mosque, and then there's the example in the book about Bellingham, where the Chinese Exclusion Act and the Naturalization Act were means for people to exploit Asian laborers and to cause them to lock South Asian workers in the City Hall basement. So these sentiments, they escalated dramatically after 9/11, and specifically Islamophobia. So, for example, just 4 days after 9/11, Frank Rock killed Balbir Singh Sodhi, and I was shocked when I read this. I could have expected that there would be a mix of emotions like anger, confusion, fear, in the aftermath that would lead to tension between Americans and Americans that look other. But I never would have guessed that it would lead to someone to murder them. I mean, he wasn't even Muslim, but that's besides the point. I read this part in the car, and I shared it with my sister, and she made this point that I hadn't thought of, but that we talked about in class today. She said that it's funny how when white men commit acts of violence like this, they aren't seen as terrorists, and that we aren't threatened by white terrorism. But yeah, I mean, she's right. Hate crimes are an unorganized form of terrorism. The white men who are caught in killing or attempting to kill people of color are penalized. I mean, Frank Rock was served, he had to serve a life sentence without parole. Richard Baumhammer and Craig Hicks are facing the death penalty. But when white people commit acts of terrorism, their race as a whole isn't portrayed as violent. Frank Rock's lawyers characterized him as mentally ill and having a diminished IQ, but it was he specifically who had the problem, and it was he specifically who would be punished for it. If Frank Rock was Muslim or anything close to it, that's not how this would go down. So it makes me think of a line in Suhair Hamad's poem when she says that she can't stand people assuming that they know me, or that I represent a people, or that a people represent an evil. So Iyer does more than just report on racism against South Asian, Arab, Muslim, and Sikh communities. She proposes a way to dismantle the racial ladder, which consists of whites on top, Asians, Arabs, and Latinos in the middle, and then blacks on the bottom. And the way she does this is by declining to join the white category, which promises white privilege, meaning you have to decline climbing the ladder on the grounds of higher socioeconomic or educational status. Because even if individuals can climb a rung or two on the ladder, there's no room, or the whites won't make room for the entire race as a whole. So that's the concept of the racial bribe. What makes South Asians so susceptible to taking the bribe is cultural exceptionalism. And when Deepa Iyer talked about cultural exceptionalism and the model minority myth on page 106, I didn't fully understand the difference. And not until reading, 2 pages later, not until reading about Devyani Khobragade exploiting Sangeeta Richard. The story is very similar to that of Peter Liang killing Akai Gurley. In Liang's case, when he was indicted after he killed Gurley, protesters declared it unjust. They wanted him to be treated with white privilege, in turn creating a divide between the Asian American community and the black communities. But they did that so that their entire race could be treated with those same privileges. In Khobragade's case, Richard spoke out against her, and she was strip searched during her arrest. Indian Americans were outraged against the treatment of Cobra Gade, but not about the way she committed fraud to bring Richard over or how she exploited Richard. What makes this a different situation, though, than Liang's case, was that Indian Americans dismissed Richard's experiences because of her lower class or her lower status. There's a perceived need to make it seem as if their entire race is of a higher socioeconomic standing so that they may keep their racial privilege. It doesn't have to do with distancing yourself from those lower on the ladder than you, but hiding the flaws of the ones in your group so that you can be accepted on the higher level. So then, declining racial bribe means keeping unity within the racial community, which means you may need to sacrifice your privileges. And I want to finish up by discussing some topics from the last chapter. The chapter begins with a discussion about how America is becoming a majority-minority or multiracial nation, and how that may influence more policies to divide or exclude non-whites based on reactions from racial anxiety. Aya writes on page 162, "We must recommit ourselves to identifying and implementing solutions to address systemic racial inequities, instead of glossing over them in the belief that they will automatically disappear as our nation's demographics shift." Because there will be other issues that arise, and Aya proposes, among other things, to hold race talks to foster empathy and understanding. Even from our brief experience in class, I really appreciate being able to talk to my peers and hear their stories from their past, and I never would have been able to hear this otherwise, so I thought that was really cool. Alright, goodbye.